Stantec and Ease Consult have been leading the consultant side of this project, including the development of the point system and ongoing implementation of it. From that consultant team, Ralph Danisco, myself, Michael Clark, and Allison Simmons from Ease Consult are leading these activities. We have a few survey questions that are peppered throughout this presentation, so we'll open this first one now to learn a little bit more about our participants today. We want to ask a question about your role in the development process. You can see the options up on the screen there: developer, broker, consultant, builder such as in construction, service provider such as a TMA, architect, attorney, or other. So we'll leave a little bit of time for folks to respond. And why don't we share the results of the poll?
Ooh, can you see the results? Oh, I might have to share them. There we go.
So as you can see, we have a bit of everybody in the room here, 7 developers, 4 each from the consultant and TMA side, some folks who identified as other, and then an attorney. So that's great. We're happy to have everybody on board today. So at this point, for some project context and background, I'm going to pass it off to Ala from BTD.
Thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us again for the second workshop in this series. So in the first workshop, we tried to kind of give an overview context of what we're doing to transportation development review and how we're revamping it and how we're thinking about it. And so some of the things we covered include the maximum parking ratios, which will play a role today as well. We also talked about the bicycle level of traffic stress, and we shared guidance on traffic counts during and post-pandemic. What we've also done is make some commitments at the end of the workshop, and Vineet Gupta will talk about it if you want to go to the second slide. Michael?
Thanks, Ala. Again, this is Vineet Gupta. I'm the planning director here at BTD. We wanted to make sure that the work that you're doing and the time commitment that you've made in the last workshop and in today's workshop, that you're seeing some substantial follow-ups. So we did manage to share with you materials from workshop 1, including a recording of the entire session. And if you haven't received that already, you can let Ala or myself know, and we'll make sure that we forward that to you. We also made some other commitments, and I won't go through these in the exact order, but we realized that there was some discussion about refining further, or rather going into a greater granular kind of analysis of the difference between lab and life science, and what that is, that a institutional land use or is that a office land use. And so that's a subgroup that we're going to put together in the coming weeks, and then we'll have an open invitation for people who want to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of kind of differentiating those land uses and their respective parking ratios. Similarly, we got a lot of feedback on really using the bicycle facilities, the bicycle level of stress analysis that we shared, how that can be used to strengthen the bicycle facilities network adjacent to your properties. And so we committed to giving you some guidance on how you can contribute to improving access for people on bicycles and what that might do to the score relative to level of stress. Finally, we want to make sure that we can have a similar session, such as the ones that we've held this month, annually. And the idea here would be to continue to get your feedback on how you have used our guidelines and our new regulations, and also to use that as an opportunity to share with you any new ideas that we might want your feedback on. So that's a commitment on 3 items. And we will, similar to providing you materials for the first workshop, we'll provide you materials which will summarize the discussion of this workshop as well. Handing it back to Allah.
Thank you, Vineet. Next slide, please. So, I just want to very quickly review the maximum parking ratios. And the reason why I want to do that is because it plays a really significant role in the framework for the TDM point system. And as we said last time, the ratios are based on analysis that takes into consideration 6 criteria. Those are the number of jobs accessible by transit in 30 minutes, the walk score, proximity to grocery stores, proximity to all types of transportation. Next slide, please. And all that it's saying is that those areas with more, that have higher proximity to infrastructure, higher proximity to grocery stores that are in walkable areas should have less parking than areas that are not as accessible. That's basically the gist of this entire thing. And it is a parcel-based analysis, which means we scored each parcel in the city of Boston. And if you look at the map, it makes sense. The areas in downtown, Back Bay, have the highest access to all kinds of transportation, are some of the most walkable areas in New England, have a plethora of options, are close to grocery stores. And so the idea here is that they would have the least amount of parking. Of course, what this means is that with less parking, we have to take seriously TDM. And we have to take seriously TDM measures on how to make sure that we can manage whatever demand of parking there still is. Next slide, please. And I just wanted, before we hand it off back to Stantec, I just wanted to very quickly review TDM just to make sure everybody's on the same page. Transportation demand management is the flip side of infrastructure, right? It's about incentivizing people to change their behavior. Right? It's not a capital project. It's not a bus priority lane. It's not changing the curb. Those things will still be, part of the development review process. But today we're just going to talk about the things that incentivize behavior change. That includes financial incentives. That includes charging for parking, unbundling the cost of parking from the rent or lease to make salient the cost of parking to the tenant, doing active marketing and a bunch of other things. The Stantec team has done a really tremendous job, doing research to try to get a real sense of which strategies are impactful, which strategies would make the most difference in reducing the demand for vehicles. And so we don't, this needs to become kind of a central part of development review and of transportation development review. It can't just be an afterthought. It needs to be, a critical part of the development process. Next slide, please. So the TDM point system, it complements and supports the parking ratios. You really can't have one without the other. You can't reduce parking without also providing TDM strategies. And just as a reminder, this is applicable to all developments over 50,000 square feet. So all developments that have to go through the Article 80 review process. And this includes compact living developments that are, again, over 50,000 square feet. And with that, I will hand it back to Ralph.
You do, it is to me. Thank you, Allah.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ralph Denisco, part of the Stantec team. And we've been doing quite a bit of work with BTD and the overall city over the last few months to really upgrade the TDM system and define it in a more systematic way. Now, what you see on the slide right now is essentially the way the system works now, and many of you have familiarity with it, and the things that frustrate you also frustrate folks at the city who you have to negotiate with, because what happens today is the requirements for transportation demand management are sort of largely undefined. There's a sort of a menu of accepted practices, and these things have accomplished much throughout the city of Boston over the last 20 years or so, but they're still irregular and uneven, and that negotiation process brings some uncertainty to all projects. It brings uncertainty to the city piece, and it doesn't always lead to productive outcomes, and it varies widely throughout the city. So I think, as Alaa was saying, the goal here was to bring kind of local and national experience and best practices to an approach to transportation demand management that simplifies and standardizes it, for all projects. So everybody has the same kind of starting point. So Michael, if you can go to the next slide. So really what we did was created a point system tool that'll eventually be online. It'll be easy to use. It'll be easy to understand. This is the first real introduction to that today. And as important is that it's integrated into the overall review process. So all of your, you'll be able to fill it out really right there when you're, somewhere between your letter of intent and your project notification form. It brings some upfront clarity to your process, to your expectations as a developer or as a consultant or an attorney going through the review process. And it's important to note that it's customizable by project, by area, by preference, right? It's not a full mandate. There's a mandate that you will have to do certain things, but you will have some choice on what those things are. And just as with the parking ratios, it'll vary somewhat based on where you are in the city. Michael will go through a bunch of the specifics for this. But again, what we've tried to do with the point system is really emphasize the things that are most successful and the most impactful, right? The things that are doing the most to change behavior from driving alone are the ones that get the highest amount of points, right? And that's the way this has sort of been structured. Michael, if you can go to the next slide. And the goals of the program are really to as I was saying, to integrate this, with the overall city process, bring some certainty to it, bring some definition to it, and ultimately build towards the point where, these things are traceable over time. Obviously, the things that are successful will evolve. The world of mobility evolves all the time. New things will come up. We'll want to incorporate them in here. This will be a living document. But most importantly, that the transportation demand management systems that are in place, the programs that you use on individual products are all in service of those larger citywide goals that run through all the various aspects of the review process here. So hopefully as we go on, we'll be able to show you what this looks like. We'll certainly have time for questions on the point systems. I think Michael even has some examples of recent projects so you can see how the new point system stacks up with kind of the way people have been doing things in the past. And really we're trying to standardize that as much as possible. So with that, I think I turn it back to you, Michael.
So we'll spend a little bit of time here walking through the framework that's been developed for this, as well as a few examples before we proceed to a question and answer session. So building upon what Alaa and Ralph have talked about, our intention with constructing this point system was to have it be as consistent with other BTD development review practices as possible. That includes a lot of the new parking ratio work that was the topic of the first workshop. And the mapping that Alaa discussed a few minutes ago really stands as a centerpiece of the point system effort as well. And the idea is that we will be requiring a certain number of points with TDM strategies assigned certain point assignments to build to that point target based off of the mobility score of the project based on where it falls within the city. So one tweak that we are proposing and making with this point system structure is instead of outlying neighborhoods hitting a mobility score of somewhere between 0 and 50 and assigning the point target as somewhere between 0 and 50, we wanted to assign kind of a minimum level of standard for all projects throughout the city. So the areas on the right-hand side here that you see in blue and gray would require a 70-point target, whereas other parts of the city would require a point target more in accordance with their actual mobility score. We'll have a slide up in just a few minutes that actually talks through some of the actual point assignments and might allow a better conceptualization of what we mean by point targets and point assignments. But these slides are really meant to walk through the underlying structure of the system and what we're looking for all development projects across the city that is tied to geographic location and really what you would expect tenants, employees, visitors, and projects to require for TDM measures. Another key aspect of this point system framework is how strategies have been bundled together. So as I mentioned, we'll have a slide that details each of these TDM strategies in just a few minutes, but I wanted to discuss the broader organization of these strategies into baseline, impact, and elective strategies. As you can see on the map on the right-hand side here, we've color-coded each of these three sort of broad categories and attempted to reflect what that would mean based off of where your project is located in Boston. What is highlighted in blue are baseline strategies. These are 4 TDM strategies that will be required in all instances throughout the city. You'll notice as we walk through some of the examples that many projects are currently doing several of these baseline strategies. So hopefully it won't be too much of an additional lift for developers and consultants to walk through, but we will be requiring
Michael, you're cutting off.
These baseline strategies throughout the city. We've then, of which one must be selected through our research and are looking at similar systems to really get at those strategies which we feel will be most effective at achieving point systems goals. And finally, we have a number of elective strategies that can be used to reach the ultimate point target. And within that bundling of elective strategies, we have a few more requirements just to satisfy certain bicycle travel and vehicle trip reduction standards, which may already be satisfied with selection of some of the impact and baseline strategies. I know that's a mouthful. Hopefully when we walk through it, it'll become a little bit clearer. But we want to take the next few slides to really kind of define what you as developers and consultants working with developers would expect when you're approaching this process within the development review framework. So first, as you're filing your letter of intent, but perhaps before the project notification form, an online application which will be developed for this effort would identify the location and the mobility score of your project. And then you would have the ability through a drop-down menu to identify your land uses and the square footage associated with those land uses. At this point, really what has been put forward for the parking ratio standards and requirements would kind of come into play here. You would see how much parking would be required given the new parking ratio standards, as well as the land use inputs that have been entered. This is important because the quantity of parking that is required for a project actually plays into the TDM points, as we will be allowing points for going below that requirement by certain percentages. Next, given all this information, the point requirements itself would be identified. You can see a few examples on the slide here. As discussed, outlying neighborhoods would not adhere tightly to the mobility score. So you can see out here in Brighton, a score of 70 would be highlighted, even though the mobility score for that area might fall between 26 and 50. That's really to highlight a minimum standard of TDM provision for each project. Whereas in downtown areas, you're seeing, whether it's in the South End or in Back Bay, requirements that adhere to the mobility score itself of 90 and 100 points. I'll emphasize here that these requirements are not tied exactly to the mobility score. We do round up to the top of it just for ease of use and understanding of satisfying different point totals. So maybe the true mobility score of the South End project is 82 or something like that. In any circumstance, if you're in that 71 to 90 bucket, the requirement would be 90 points. So it's at this point that we'll really get into the nitty gritty of this and select some TDM strategies. As mentioned, the online application is still to be developed, but the idea is that we would have a drop-down menu of all strategies which are available and be able to define which of these are baseline strategies, which of these are impact strategies, and which of these are elective strategies. We've put a few examples of what some of these strategies look like, but as discussed in just a moment, we'll have a slide with all of the strategies and the point assignments that we've been thinking of. But the idea is that at this stage of the process, project proponents would only be able to proceed when the certain point requirement has been met, given the points that have been assigned to each strategy. This is a really critical piece. As Ralph discussed a few minutes ago, one of our key goals and objectives of this effort is to remove a lot of the more negotiation-minded aspects of development review as it relates to TDM today, and turn it into something that is more of a broader commitment that is made at the opening stages of the development review process. That doesn't mean that BTD isn't receptive to revisiting certain characteristics of TDM programs as the development review process carries on. Obviously, a one-size-fits-all solution is very hard to achieve, so we understand that there are certain aspects of projects that require some level of consideration between developers, consultants, and BTD. But we do want to have a framework which solidifies what strategies are going to be put forward for development projects from the outset. At this point, with each of these TDM strategies, you'll have an opportunity to review before submitting for the city to sort of advance to the next step of the development review process. And then the idea is that over the life of the TAPA, that there will be certain reporting requirements and adjustments which can be made to TDM programs over the long term. This aspect of the process still needs a little more definition to it. We hope that some of the feedback that we hear today can help us define what we should be thinking about in terms of monitoring requirements for certain TDM strategies, what it means to satisfy certain TDM strategies, and what it can mean moving forward regarding a development project's actual performance in achieving mode shift and achieving the goals of the TDM point system, as well as broader goals of the city in achieving mode shift. These are still being thought out. We would love to hear some feedback about what we should be mindful of as a project monitors its progress moving forward. So as promised, this is our pretty busy point assignments slide. I'll stick on this for a moment. We can also go back to this as part of the Q&A, and this will also be part of our breakout room discussion as well. So this is not your only chance to look at what our current line of thinking for points are. But to reiterate some of the framework, what is on the left-hand slide here are baseline strategies outlined in blue. As mentioned, these are strategies that we hope to require for all projects moving forward. These points for each of these 4 strategies add up to 40. These 40 points will be applicable when you are inputting each of your kind of inputs of strategies and looking to hit your point targets of 70 to 100. You're starting off with 40, provided that you can satisfy these baseline strategies. And if for some reason you don't think you can satisfy these baseline strategies, that's a piece of feedback that we'd love to hear today, because the research showed that these are very impactful. They're already, a standard of practice has already been built in the city for using many of these strategies. except in some instances like a TMA membership, which might not be available in your neighborhood. The idea is that these are going to be used moving forward for all projects. I'll next direct your attention to the impact strategies in this darker red up on the top here. These are 3 strategies: transit subsidy, parking reduction, and parking pricing, which through our research and looking at some of the peer cities, we found to be the most impactful in achieving mode shift and reducing driver load rates. And the idea is that all projects would need to select one of these impact strategies, no matter where they are in the city. You'll notice that we have a range of points defined for each of these impact strategies, as well as for some other strategies below. And this means that we want to be mindful of certain levels of satisfying these point requirements and these strategies as a whole. So to take parking reduction as an example, going through the process that we just outlined, you'll have a point requirement through you'll have a parking ratio requirement through the parking ratio work. If you go below that requirement by a certain percentage, say 25%, that gets you some points. If you go below it by a much higher percentage, you get more points out of that. So we want to be mindful of the level of commitment towards a transit subsidy or a pricing mechanism or parking reduction, and be able to scale points to further incentivize providing better subsidies or providing less parking, or with some of these more elective strategies, say adding more bicycle parking spaces. And then below each of this, we have our elective strategies. These are meant to be selected to fill out the rest of your point requirements. You would not be prevented from selecting 2 impact strategies to satisfy the requirement. We absolutely would encourage that. So these are available as elective strategies as well. I'll emphasize with the bicycle strategies, the idea is that you must select one of these. And with the vehicle strategies, one of these must be selected as well. Although if you are selecting parking reduction or parking pricing as an impact strategy, that will count towards that requirement. I know this is a lot to digest. As mentioned, we can have this slide up during the Q&A. It will be part of the breakout room discussion, but we'll spend a little bit of time walking through project examples, and you can see how this would work in practice. But first, we wanted to add a quick survey question just to get a better feel for our audience and to have you guys engage for a moment. And that's to ask whether you are or have worked with a TMA for projects before. So we'll leave this up for just a few more moments. All right, I think we can share the results. You can see quite a few of us, close to 3/4 of us are a member of or have worked with the TMA before, which is great to hear. We expect TMAs to play a key role either as a TDM strategy for development projects to take advantage of, or to assist developers in their TDM offerings as part of this point system itself. So that's great to see. So I'm going to advance next to the project examples. And I should clarify, when I have been talking about parking requirements, they're not really parking requirements, because if you don't want to provide parking, that is something that the city would be receptive to as well. To clarify that these are parking maximums. I apologize for kind of mixing that terminology up. So with our project examples, again, we'll emphasize the baseline, impact, and elective dichotomy to each of our TDM strategies. And we have 5 examples up on the screen here: Fenway Center, Winthrop Square, Seaport Square, Dot Block, and 3368 Washington Street. We'll walk through each of these. I think we'll see a pretty consistent story as we walk through each of these 5 examples of point totals falling really within a similar range for each of these. And in some instances, they allow for satisfaction of point requirements. And in some cases, they fall a little bit short of what a requirement would be. But we really hope to relay with these examples that it's just a little bit of tweaking to satisfy the point requirements. And we're hopeful that what's being put forward with this overall effort is not going to be seen as too challenging for developers to implement with projects. So we'll first start out with Winthrop Square Tower. With each of these slides on the left-hand side here, we've defined the characteristics of the project, the mobility score and the point target, as well as the new vehicle parking maximum and bicycle parking minimums, and the vehicle parking and the bicycle parking that has been proposed as part of the effort, and a map of where you can see where the project falls. I should emphasize that each of these projects are the subject of recent TAPAs in the last 2 to 3 years. So these strategies are taken from the TAPAs. One exception to that is that each of these 4 baseline categories that we've called out in the blue here, we have included for each of these 4 projects. Again, that's with the understanding that baseline strategies will be required in all instances. So we wanted to include it for all projects. Not all of these projects have committed in TAPAs to each of these, but the idea is moving forward, any new TAPA would need to commit to all of these. And if for any reason that seems challenging for folks, that's the type of feedback that we'd love to hear. But you can see with Winthrop Square Tower, with the impact strategies and the elective strategies that have been identified, we get to 85 points. That falls a little bit below the 100-point requirement. We'll take note that one of the bicycle-related measures that could be selected as an elective strategy has not been selected, actually, in any of the cases for each of these 5 projects. So the requirement to select a bicycle-related measure would further up the point total. We'd also note that given how the TAPA is written, which encouraged transit subsidies and parking cash outs for employers, as discussed, the submission requirements still need to be further defined, but the level of feedback regarding whether employers can be required to do these things is what we want to hear from folks. But some commitments that were made in the TAPA regarding transit subsidies and parking cash out, if those are found to meet the submission requirements, they would be listed here, and that would easily go over the 100-point requirement. Our next project is Seaport Square, block L4 of that. The Seaport has a lower mobility score than downtown, so the point target is 90 and not 100. And you can see with the vehicle parking and the bicycle parking where we're not able to provide points for that. But again, our identified strategies providing the 40 points for baseline, a parking pricing provides 20 points, as well as the mixed use development, having the 81,000 square feet of retail and restaurant uses on top of the over 400,000 square feet of office, provides those 10 mixed use development points. So this gets to 70 points out of 90. Again, a bicycle related strategy would identify a few more points for this project. We've identified a few additional strategies which could be employed here, whether it's parking reduction, a parking cash out mechanism, or carpool and car share measures. One of these or a combination of a few of these can get this effort to 90 points. Dot block, which we wanted to identify as a compact living example down in Dorchester near the Savin Hill Red Line station. This is largely a residential project with a small retail component. Our point target is 70 points, and you can see outlined on the left-hand side here, vehicle parking is being provided at a rate well below the vehicle parking maximum. So with a 31% less parking provision, we're able to provide points here for that parking reduction as an impact strategy. So we've identified 2 impact strategies here, which is great. That provides 30 points. And then we provide 5 points because one of our mixed use development requirements is on-site laundry services. So this leads to this project satisfying the point requirement. We would still require that additional bike related measure. So a few more points would be added on here. But this is an example of a project that would be satisfying the point requirement as we've outlined here. Our next project is Fenway Center, a largely housing unit project with a smaller retail component, point target of 90. You can see here our vehicle parking max. This project is also not approaching that maximum, but we have outlined a 25% sort of minimum reduction that would be needed to satisfy the parking reduction point requirement. So we're unable to provide it in this case, but again, it's that type of feedback on whether that's realistic as a submission requirement that we'd love to hear from folks. You can see with this project, we've identified 75 points as part of the TDM strategies that falls a little bit below the point requirement. As with the rest of these, we would require a bicycle related measure. And then for additional strategies, ideas could be transit subsidy, as mentioned, the parking reduction or car share membership in subsidy. We really hope to relay with each of these project examples that don't quite hit the point requirement, that it's not a whole lot of extra work to get there. And finally, with 3368 Washington Street in Jamaica Plain, this is largely a supportive and affordable housing development project with a small office component. Our point target here is 70 points, and you can see partly given the population involved here, the vehicle parking has been provided at a rate well below the maximum. So we're able to provide a lot of points for parking reduction in this instance, 25 out of 30 possible points, as well as the on-site laundry services for mixed-use development. That gets this project up to 70 points, which meets the point requirement. And the bicycle-related strategy would add a little bit more to that as well. So before we go on to the Q&A, we'll just ask this last survey question because we will be having a discussion in the breakout rooms regarding compliance and monitoring. So we're curious, in your instances, who is generally responsible for monitoring TABA compliance? Our options are to use an on-site property manager, hire a subject matter expert consultant, partnering with a TMA or other. And we'll emphasize that this is for how your team is currently handling these and not how you might envision it moving forward. So we'll leave this up for another moment. I think we'll close the polling. Great, now I think folks can can see results. Sorry, I might not have clicked that before. We have a mix of use of on-site property managers and hiring of subject matter expert consultants, as well as one participant indicated partnering with a TMA, and a couple of other responses. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And I think at this point, we're going to proceed to questions and answers. So a couple of things as we proceed to questions and answers. If you could place questions in the chat box, that is one means by which we can respond to the Q&A, but you're also welcome to raise your hand as well. And I see that Tad, you've raised your hand. So I think if you want to unmute yourself, we can start with you.
Thanks, everybody. This is a great presentation and a really impressive system. I know a lot of work has gone into it, and it's extraordinary. I do have a question, and I missed the first meeting. You may have discussed this or covered this then, but it's about the issue of telework. And it seems to me the pandemic has sort of unveiled, an enormous opportunity to rethink the way Americans work. I mean, it's happened before our very eyes. It's sort of the elephant in the room. And I'm wondering to what extent this is causing us to think about differently about parking demand, to think about a point system that contemplates a much greater potential for telework. think about a greater potential for parking reduction. I'm just wondering to what extent this is causing us to sort of think about the possibilities here. It seems to me there's a real opportunity not just to observe, but to lead because of what we're seeing. I may be wrong, I may be mistaken, I may be being idealistic, but it just seems to me there's an enormous potential here. And then the flip side of that is, if there is a huge potential, it seems to me that that potential is greater or lesser depending on the land use. For example, at a hospital or where work requires that people be on site, you know, there's much less potential. So for example, with lab, and I mentioned labs because there's a huge demand for lab space in the larger Boston real estate market right now. What is the actual demand for parking in labs? What is the elasticity of demand for telework and parking in lab uses? So it's really a two-part question. And just wondering, again, you may not have the answers right now, but it just seems to me that this is an unusual opportunity to rethink some of these things. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. This is Annette, and you know, Michael, Ralph, feel free to jump in, but I think that's a really fantastic question. It's, you know, what we're seeing is that more people want more parking for lab, just based on the commute survey that we did with A Better City, you know, there's definitely going to be an increase of people wanting to drive alone, which is something that we have to curb. And this is a perfect opportunity to curb that, what may be an inevitable desire. But I think that's a fantastic question. We have to really think about it and consider it as well.
Thank you.
I'll add that this point system as a whole is really meant to be a living, breathing thing moving forward. So we understand that commuting patterns and transportation conditions, whether it is pre-COVID in 2020, post-COVID, hopefully this year, or 5 or 10 years from now, might all look quite different from one another. So as the system is further refined and those monitoring requirements are further defined, we want to be able to adjust to changing commuting patterns, whether it is a much higher rate of teleworking by land uses, and certainly strategies which require some type of ongoing cost, like a transit subsidy. We don't want to end up we don't want a developer, we don't want a project to end up in a system where money is being spent on the transit subsidy that nobody is ending up using because they're working from home, for instance. Those are the types of things that we want to hear about today, and also the types of things that BTD will be particularly mindful of moving forward.
And it varies, you know, I think a couple of people said it, we see it now playing out really in a widely variable format based on land use, right? You know, housing has its own demands, you know, typical office space or retail or commercial or lab or institutional or hospital or medical are all seeing different aspects of how this is playing out. And, you know, I don't know that anybody knows what all those answers are, but I would agree it's something worth not just paying a lot of attention to, but trying to proactively, you know, put in place the policies that meet those demands, but still fit within the city's overall goals.
I would just add too, I think there's a real opportunity for the TMAs to play a significant role here because they tend to be a little bit more in depth with employers and property managers. And I think getting an understanding of what percentage of folks are teleworking, how many days a week they can, would open up some opportunities around shared parking and just kind of capitalizing and utilizing telework as a TDM strategy is something I think could be definitely looked at.
So there's, here we have another question by Tom. To Tad's point, how would this play out in an institutional setting where parking needs are driven by patients due to health concerns? They have to travel by car, of course. And in the parking ratios, the maximums are pretty high for medical offices and medical institutions already, Tom. But, you know, when we think about TDM for hospitals, we're really talking about the 9 to 5 administrative staff, not really, you know, understanding that some people are called at different times, they're on call, understanding that, you know, nurses, surgeons, et cetera, are on call, and that some patients just need to get by car. And so I think that is reflected in the parking ratios already. For Scott Mullen, is there a plan for annual or other timeline, annual review and update? Yeah, there's going to be a reporting component to this. Certainly, this, you know, for not just for the TDM point system, but for TAPA as a whole. We haven't gotten to that yet, but there is going to be a reporting and monitoring requirement as part of the revamping process. Time frame for the pilot. As soon as the TDM point system is done, we are going to release it simultaneously with the parking ratios. The TDM point system will not necessarily be a pilot, the parking ratios will, because there's clearly some further refinement that may be needed. And so certainly the parking ratios, they will be released simultaneously with the TDM point system, and they will be piloted. The TDM point system may be tweaked, but it's pretty definitive, I think, once it's released. Like, you know, every development will have to go through the TDM point system. Every development will have to take TDM very, very seriously and have to think about impact measures and impact strategies as part of the strategy to reduce drive-along rates.
Well, I know that Yanni has had his hand raised for a few minutes, so maybe we
Sure.
allow him to ask his question.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks everybody for doing this study. Really, you know, really obviously interesting stuff, and I think we're all aligned on, you know, what the end goal is here. Big picture. I am curious though, what steps have been taken by the study team to interview, you know, the customer base, the large employers who are, you know, through the course of the pandemic, keeping the city's economy afloat and really are the future of the city in terms of their growth. You know, a lot of the folks on the call today are consultants, or, you know, like our colleagues at Millennium or Skanska who are on the call also. You know, we build the core and shell of these buildings, but ultimately it's the large employers who fill them, who are the customer here and who drive the city's economy. It's not us. And a lot of the things that we've seen today, I suspect, you know, Carolyn and Russ and Joe might agree. You know, I'm not sure how these would be received, especially when these are large employers that could go anywhere in the country for their needs. And so I would just want to be sure, before any of this kind of hits the books in any meaningful way, that the end client, the customer base for the city's economy and the sector on which the city's future depends, as far as future growth, have an opportunity to weigh in a major way. You know, we're all stakeholders, but I think asking, you know, the Vertexes of the world and the Amazons of the world, and, you know, lots and lots of other large employers that are driving the city's economic future, how they feel about these topics, I think that would be really, really important, because a lot of times, a lot of the things that are being talked about aren't up to us as the lowly landlord. You know, transit subsidies and whatnot for employees, they're up to the employer. And so I think that's an important piece that I would really urge the study team to focus on, because one would really be really unfortunate if there were unintended consequences whereby a really well-intentioned public policy objective, like TDM, for example, you know, ended up making Boston less competitive. When these are employers that could go anywhere in the country, especially at a time like this, when we're trying desperately to come out of a pandemic. I really think that this is an important topic, and would love to hear the study team's perspective on what the plan is there. Thank you very much.
Glad you asked that. We're actually working with a Better City to interview employers and on their plans post-COVID, and we will be releasing with a Better City, releasing kind of a summary of that. So yeah, we have been talking to employers, at least our partners at a Better City have been, and to kind of get a sense of what their plans are post-COVID. And Scott, feel free if you'd like to share some tidbits.
I just wanted to add, this is Vineet Gupta. I just wanted to add to what Allah has just said. First, Yanni, I think you bring up a really important point, and I think that for our policies to work, we want to make sure that they are practical for our major employers who continue to use Boston as a venue for their businesses. So Allah mentioned that we have established a partnership with TMAs, particularly a Better City. We've also been talking with the Seaport TMA and to make sure that big employers in that part of the city have also an opportunity to participate in these discussions. About a year ago, we actually, with our Office of Economic Development, this is John Barros's team, we actually convened, through them, we identified employers ranging from MGH down to smaller businesses, and talked to them about our parking ratios and about our transportation demand management. And we got some interesting feedback, and we used MIT, their program, as a kind of a model program for TDM and how well that worked for MIT employees. We also had people from large institutions, which are our major employers, our universities in the room. So yes, definitely we need to continue to do that kind of discussion with employers.
The other thing I just want to highlight is that, Cambridge, the city of Cambridge, and I think Stephanie Grohl is on the line with us here, has been requiring some, fantastic and intense TDM requirements for a long time with reporting and meticulous reporting and monitoring requirements. So we're not the first to be doing this. We're just trying to play catch up to Cambridge in some ways. So, and other towns and cities are heading in that direction here as well.
And I would add, at the state level, there's a rideshare requirement. So almost all employers that have over 500 employees have been engaged in TDM for 20 plus years. I think they all kind of consider it best practices in the Boston market to provide subsidies for transit, to have bike rooms. I mean, I think it's kind of become a normal practice with large employers. I think what we're hoping to do with the point system is to expand that beyond the downtown core and to make sure that smaller employers and neighborhoods other than just downtown core and Seaport and the LMA are also getting benefits from transportation demand management.
Not to pile on here, but one thing we did do that was, I think part of what BTD asked the team to do was also to look at other cities around the country's experiences with their TDM programs, with developing these kinds of point systems. We've had a number of those conversations with cities around the country and their experience.
All right, we have another question from Carolyn, and I think this is for the Stantec team. Can you define what unbundled market rate parking means as a baseline strategy? Tenants often demand bundled reserved parking, so I can see this as a limiting factor when attracting tenants to new buildings.
Sure. So by unbundled market rate parking, we simply mean separating out the cost of constructing, maintaining, providing that parking space with the rest of the rent for that tenant. This is often a strategy that is cited for residential uses. It's often cited for housing, since not all residents might want a parking space associated with their new apartment. But we want to provide this as a strategy for commercial, office, retail, what have you, projects as well, just to best separate out that need for parking from the parking supply itself. So I don't think it changes a whole lot in terms of kind of ongoing operations of how those costs are relayed to tenants. It's more just making it apparent that this is what you are paying for, and if you don't want to pay for this, this is an option for you to proceed without that parking provision.
Yeah, it's about making it visible. It's ultimately about making those costs visible and showing them as separate from the rent, even though you can still certainly reserve a number of spaces for a particular user.
This is Molly from A Better City. If I could just pop in for a quick second. I do have one question. Well, first of all, this is a tremendous amount of amazing work. I have to say that the sort of standardization, the transparency, the flexibility. I'm very, very excited about this. And I think I want to commend the team for putting this together. And I'm excited. And I'm hearing some trepidation, obviously from Yanni. And I think having this forum to have this discussion, again, I just want to say thank you for this. One thing I'm interested to know is, this is obviously for new developments. Are we going to be able to somehow rate or rank existing, for example, spotlight some of our existing employers that are doing really great TDM work and get them some sort of badge or ranking based around this? Is there any thought been put into that?
So can I pile on for just a minute? Because the city depends, for all its basic city service, depends on new growth. And to put building A that was finished last year, in a different category around what its obligations are versus building B that's maybe starting construction this year, that dichotomy is really, I think, challenging when you're trying to set a pro-growth sort of overarching umbrella. And so trying to find some kind of level playing field between existing product and development product it should also be an important question here, at least from the perspective of the development industry, given the importance of new development and growth to the city's fiscal future.
I love that idea. I love the idea of having sort of a certification. I would refer to the city to say whether or not we could do that, but I think similar to LEED certification or whatever, it would be great to sort of have TDM champions highlighted.
This sounds like a great idea. I think we just have to figure out the mechanics and not just do it for the thrill of doing it, for cheap thrills, but to use that to actually help encourage more and more employers to offer these TDM programs.
I don't want to leave. This is Russ DiMartino. I don't want to leave Yanni hanging on this. I do agree with him that as a developer, there is trepidation. I did want to clarify, Yanni, what you mean is for developers as opposed to existing building owners setting a level playing field so that new development projects can quote unquote compete with them in terms of the offering from a parking perspective. Is that what you're getting at?
Parking and TDM, because some of the measures that have been described in the TDM point system really are employer level measures. They're not landlord level measures. And so just making sure that the next big employer isn't looking at Boston versus, some other municipality or one building versus another building and seeing a big difference. Just because these things are all prospective, none of them are
Yep.
retrospective or universally applied. The way, for example, some of the energy stuff is universally applied as far as energy reporting, and that is an equalizer for sure.
Yep.
Thanks. I'm sorry.
I then completely echo what Yanni is saying. As a developer, that is where the trepidation is coming from. Not that we disagree that these measures are in the right direction, but they
Right.
create a problem with the competitiveness of new projects, and that is primarily where the trepidation is coming from.
That's right. It's not a disagreement with the policy objective. Believe both of us. Thank you.
I think one way you can look at it is that, I understand the point. There's a competitiveness from a kind of a cost perspective. For sure, there's also a competitiveness on the part of the kinds of programs that a building or a neighborhood or a city would offer. I know that in our work, around the country, many of the mobility options that Boston already affords and that programs like this will expand upon are the sorts of things that not all, but many companies and many employers and many employees are looking for as well. So it's I don't want to simplify the answer. I think there's a tangled knot of all of those competing considerations, which you guys have to live every day. But I think it's worth thinking about it in that way as well.
Yeah, and other cities have similar policies to this. San Francisco has a TDM point system. Seattle has TDM requirements. So again, this is not the first city or the first TDM point system. And a lot of the stuff in the TDM point system, should be considered incentives and pluses to draw in employees. A city that is, congestion choked is not a city, as the Boston Globe highlighted in their Spotlight series. People will move away because of congestion, and people will move away if they're stuck in traffic for 2 hours, right? So we have to have some kind of thinking and policy to addressing congestion, which is the real economic chokeholder here. There are any other questions? Go ahead, Ralph, you wanted to say something?
Well, I was going to say, at the risk of segueing us into the breakout rooms, I think the actual points and the programs, obviously there's been a lot of thought and research behind them, but they're certainly something I think we want to talk about in the breakout rooms. It's set up to do that. But in terms of the policy itself, the overarching goal of what we're talking about, which I was presenting earlier, is all of those things already exist in some form today in the city of Boston. And you and I and everybody in this call is negotiating them with not a lot of standards on a project by project basis. The overall goal here is that we are establishing, at least on the go forward, some sort of standardization of what those points count for, what is impactful, what is not. That still provides some choice, so it's not just the luck of the draw over who happens to be negotiating what at a certain time or what anybody cares about, right? It'll put some real numbers and some background and some research to each of those things. I think within that, there's room to discuss whether something should get 5 points or 7 points or 12.5 points or any of those things. And I think that's part of what we've set this up for.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, maybe we can move on to the breakout groups.
we're all back here. I don't know if you want to lead this part of the discussion, but I think the plan was just to have our three facilitators report out what we heard in the breakout rooms. So I can start. We got a lot of good feedback, particularly regarding monitoring, as well as feedback on some of the strategies themselves. There were questions regarding how monitoring would work, and we wanted to emphasize that really the goal of monitoring is to demonstrate success, demonstrate that certain strategies are being satisfied given the requirements that will be put forward about what it means to satisfy that. The point of the monitoring is not to see everything between a developer and a tenant and make through leases. It's BTD would not be looking for things that go beyond kind of the scope of this program as a whole. The idea is to really demonstrate success, but the idea is also understanding that the transportation world in 5 or 10 years might not look like what it looks like in 2021. It's also a check for the city to think about what strategies are working, what strategies aren't working. Are there any new technologies that have come into existence that we should be folding into the program? It's as much a check on BTD's own operations and the point system and its ability to bring about citywide goals as it is on developers carrying out those requirements that have been laid out. We also had a few comments about the parking reduction and just noting that the parking maximums that were discussed in the workshop a couple of weeks ago are quite strong, and to further reduce parking based off of those maximums might be a little bit challenging. But we hope that, this is me editorializing, we hope that some of the other impact strategies and elective strategies and whatnot provide that avenue for hitting what would end up being a point requirement, even if something like further parking reduction is not feasible for a project. So I guess I will ask Allison if you have any feedback to provide.
Sure. So our group was great, had some really great feedback on a lot of different fronts. In terms of the actual TDM point assignments and strategies, folks were pretty enthusiastic about the parking strategies and felt pretty comfortable with the various parking strategies, which from a team members that created it perspective and the city's perspective, I think is great, since those are strategies we know to be super impactful. There was some questions and concerns and clarification I think needed on a few strategies, including parking cash out, which is one that is sort of all encompassing. So that makes sense. I think that we need to sort of drill down a little bit more on what we mean by parking cash out and how that would work, how we would monitor it, how do we implement something like that. Similar with the e-bike and cargo bikes, and that's obviously a newer strategy that we haven't really spent a lot of time implementing in the city, but that I think is a great opportunity. So I think further clarification around what the opportunities are there, I think would be great. In terms of the larger questions, any sort of things that we would like this city to consider for land use types. There was, again, sort of thinking through exceptions potentially. What happens if there's a notice of project change? What happens if the land use of the project changes partway through? How do we kind of pivot as the life of a development comes into fruition? And then also more discussion around sort of how do we do the equity between those who have been subject to this and those who haven't? How do we kind of bring everybody in line with TDM? And then in terms of sort of the considerations around requirements for monitoring, I think positive feedback on the fact that it's online, but some further clarification on the fact sheets. We mentioned in our group that we're going to be doing fact sheets for each strategy. So one really great option was to include what is not included in the strategy. So sometimes if we kind of paint with a broad brush, defining what it is, but also maybe potentially saying what it's not for folks who might be less familiar with a particular strategy. That's it. And I guess Ralph is up next.
Sure, and I'll try not to repeat things that folks said in other groups, because I think we had some similar feedback. I'll augment, we did talk about the strategy sheets in our group as well. I think it's more and more clear that they're going to be an extraordinarily useful tool. Let's make sure we get them right. And one of the aspects of it is where we defined a range for something like you get 5 to 15 points. There has been some thinking about what qualifies for each of those. And there may be some room for discussion between the proponent and the city about, this is what we can do. We think it's worth this much, and vice versa. We'll give some guidelines for that. But obviously, the bigger or more complicated the project, the more nuanced that would be. A couple of other things. One, even on the first sheet, it was really heartening to see how many blue dots there were, right? Programs that people are already doing, which I think emphasizes the point of this program, that we're really standardizing many of the approaches that folks are already doing and making it easier to achieve your ultimate goals and to minimize the negotiation and the back and forth. I think that's going to continue to evolve. And in terms of the questions on the individual projects, on the individual strategies, really focused a lot on monitoring as well. How do we make it easy for people to monitor it, but get useful information for the city on an ongoing basis? How do we align that with whatever other monitoring a project has to do? So we're minimizing the asks and collecting all that data appropriately. And then I think finding more opportunities where the city itself or a TMA can really help a proponent achieve the strategies, right? What can be done to make it easier to get your points, to implement these programs? And I think, again, the more they're standardized, the easier they will be, because there'll be more examples to point to, and they'll be done in a certain way. So a lot, just in case I missed anything, I know you are co-facilitating with me. Let me know if there's anything else to cover.
You covered it perfectly. Thank you, Ralph.
Excellent.
So I think that closes our program for this afternoon. I want to thank everybody for taking some time with us. Ala, I don't know if there's anything more you want to add.
Like last time, we'll send all the information. And I think Michelle had said at the beginning that this video is being recorded, so we will send a recording of this as well. And for further questions, feel free to send an email to me and Vineet. We'd be happy to respond.
And just to add to that, this is Vineet Gupta. We will keep everybody who has participated and others as well who are unable to participate informed as we figure out the precise next steps to move forward with these policies. And so be on the lookout for that. Feel free to contact us one-on-one if you'd like. If there was any specific issue that you were particularly interested in kind of getting more discussion on, we'd be happy to talk with you. So thank you again for participating. This is really, really useful for the city and will add value to having policies that work for everyone.